My best friend of 50 years married my ex-husband. I smiled at their wedding, but even then I knew she would soon regret her choice. Her life turned into hell. Stay with us until the very end to find out how the story ends. We look forward to your comments and thoughts on the story. My name was Suzanne, and by the age of 55, I knew a little more about life than I would have liked, especially about friendship, especially about betrayal. I stood at the back of the hall, near the exit, watching my former best friend, Helen, walk down the aisle to Mendelssohn's wedding march in a long white dress. She walked slowly, with a haughty bearing and a slightly forced smile. The guests stood up and applauded. Everything seemed beautiful, even too beautiful. Standing next to her was him, Mark, my ex-husband. He was holding her hand, the same hand that had hugged me after a hard day many years ago, the same hand that had once signed our marriage certificate, and the same hand that, according to rumors, had taken Helen's hand right behind my back when we were still married. I didn't make a single sudden movement. I didn't raise a single eyebrow. I just smiled, quietly, without malice, because at that moment I knew that what was happening now was not the beginning of their fairy tale. It was the prologue to another story, a story they hadn't yet understood. But I already understood. Helen had been my friend for over 20 years. We had been through divorces, raising children, failed diets, tears, and parties together. She had always been bright, loud, a little theatrical. It was easy with her until it became difficult. Then I started to notice how she joked about my husband, how she laughed at how boring I had become, how she sent me photos of his parties after the divorce. Oops, I didn't mean to. I pretended not to notice. And then I realized she had always been jealous. She liked being in the background, as long as I was in the spotlight. And now she's getting married. He's the groom. And I'm just a guest they didn't invite, but whose presence would scare them more than thunder on a clear day. But I didn't come to take revenge. I came to see how it all begins, so that later I won't turn away when it starts to fall apart. And believe me, it will happen very soon. When I entered the reception hall, almost no one recognized me. I didn't look like the ex-wife that people usually imagine, with traces of tears, bad makeup, and a forced smile. No, I came in a calm, light-colored dress, with my head held high and the eyes of someone who is no longer afraid of anything. Roger, a mutual acquaintance, was the first to notice me. He came over and leaned closer. Suzanne? Is that you? Damn, you look great. Do they know you're here? I just smiled. You think they had a chance to forget me? He smiled, but his eyes remained troubled. He knew how it all started. He knew how much I loved Mark. He knew how Helen came to me at night when her life was falling apart, and how I hit her when her third husband threw her out on the street. Yes, her third. I took a glass of champagne and walked slowly around the room. Inside, I still felt strange, not resentment, not anger, but a quiet, even slightly sad understanding. I saw Helen talking to her friends, Mark slipping away to check his phone. I saw them avoiding looking at each other when no one was watching. It was too early for distance, too early for pretense, even in front of everyone. And I knew that this marriage had not begun with love, but with a desire to prove something. She wanted to show that she was better than me. He wanted to show that he hadn't lost. And I wanted peace. But peace doesn't come when you forget everything, but when you learn to remember and not suffer. Helen finally noticed me. Her eyes widened. Her face tightened into a mask of politeness, behind which panic was hidden. I nodded to her lightly, almost friendly. She pursed her lips and turned away. At that moment, I realized it wasn't me who was afraid to come. They were afraid that I was still there. Sometimes, to understand where the end began, you have to go back to the very beginning. Mark and I didn't have a perfect marriage. There were no fireworks, movies in the rain, or declarations of love on a bridge. Everything was mundane, but solid. We met at work. I had just returned from my second maternity leave, and he was leading one of the projects. He was 7 years older than me, confident, polite, and quiet. At the time, I just wanted peace and quiet, and he seemed like a safe haven. We lived together for almost 16 years. We had a son, paid off our mortgage, survived our parents' illnesses, trips to the sea, and long winters. He rarely said he loved me, but he always came when I was sick. I was sure that not everything had to be like in the movies. The main thing was stability. And perhaps it was this very stability that eventually destroyed me. The first signs were subtle. He began to stay late at work more often. At first, he would call and apologize. Then he just stopped coming home. On my birthday, I increasingly received gifts chosen by someone else. He gave me things that had nothing to do with me. Sets of glasses when I don't drink, bracelets I don't wear, books I would never read. I noticed how he was withdrawing into himself. I asked him, "Is everything okay?" He nodded, turned away. Sometimes he hugged me briefly, almost like a stranger. And I thought, well, it happens. We'll get through it. Midlife crisis, fatigue. We're together, and that's what matters. But one day in the bathroom, I noticed a sequin on his shirt. Barely noticeable. Not mine. I don't wear anything shiny literally or figuratively. And then there was the scent. Light, sharp, too young. As if a strange woman had brushed against his jacket. As if someone else's life had been left on him. Helen was often at our house at that time. She was always around, even too much so. She always knew when I was fighting with Mark, when I was upset. She would come over with wine and pizza, sit in my kitchen, and then suddenly say, "You know, you've become a completely different person. Not the one I used to be friends with." "What do you mean?" I asked, surprised. "Well, you're tired. It's all about the house, all about your son. You used to be more vibrant. You should go out somewhere. Mark must be bored. Men are like children." I didn't understand why she said that at the time. Now I do. When Mark left, he didn't say where he was going. He just packed a suitcase, got in the car, and said, "You're a good woman. But I can't do this anymore." A month later, I saw them together. In the parking lot of a shopping center. He was holding her hand. She was laughing. He was looking at her, just like he used to look at me. Or maybe he never looked at me like that. When Mark left, I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to smash plates, rip photos out of albums, or call everyone I knew and say, "Can you believe what he did?" I just felt quiet. It was as if someone had turned off the sound in my life. Everything slowed down, my footsteps in the kitchen, the kettle boiling loudly, and even the clock, which I hadn't noticed before. It ticked as if it were counting my new life, the one where there was no longer us, only me. I didn't cry, not for the first week. And then, I burst into tears when I tried to get a jar off the shelf and accidentally broke a mug. His mug, the one he drank his coffee from every morning. And that sound, the sound of a broken mug, was louder than any of his words. Because he didn't explain anything. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't admit anything. He didn't ask to stay friends. He just disappeared. My son was studying in another state at the time. I didn't want to worry him. He knew about the divorce, of course, but he didn't go into details. "Everything's fine, Mom," he said. "The main thing is that you're okay." I nodded. And I lied. Because I wasn't okay. I was alone. And loneliness isn't silence. It's when you speak and no one hears you. Helen didn't call. Not a word. Not even an attempt to explain, out of politeness. Or maybe that was exactly why she knew there was nothing to explain. I remembered how she said she didn't want to get married. That men were weak and freedom was power. And now she was walking arm in arm with my ex. She smiled in photos, posted dinners and seascapes on social media with captions like, "Sometimes happiness comes when you least expect it." I watched, but I didn't comment. I learned to be silent. And silence is stronger than revenge if you know what to do with it. After 6 months, I stopped checking her page. I started running in the mornings. I changed my hairstyle. I bought a gym membership and signed up for Spanish classes. I didn't want to become a new woman. I wanted to get back the woman they had once quietly pushed out of my life. And then one day, looking in the mirror, I suddenly realized I was alive again. Not broken, not forgotten, real, without him, and without her. One spring day, Monica, a mutual acquaintance, called me. She was naive and talkative, but not malicious. The kind of person who could never keep a secret for more than 5 minutes. Suzanne, she began excitedly. I'm sorry to intrude, but you need to know this. I fell silent. My heart, I must admit, was pounding not from fear, but from a strange, half-forgotten excitement. Helen, Monica continued. She was in tears at the salon today. She was sitting there, holding her head in her hands. Something about Mark not being home for 3 nights. Can you imagine? I didn't answer right away. I just closed my eyes. And she said she thinks he's cheating on her. Can you imagine? They've only been married a year. I wasn't surprised. Rather, I felt everything fall into place. Helen, who was always looking for a party, finally got a permanent party, but it turned out that in this house she wasn't the hostess, just the decoration. Mark, who once grew tired of my housework, suddenly discovered that there was nothing to talk about with Helen. She didn't listen, she talked. She didn't engage, she judged. He sought admiration. She sought status. And now their mirror image fairy tale was beginning to cloud over. Cracks appeared thin as cobwebs. But I saw them. A week later, I went to the same salon as Helen. On purpose, yes. I knew that sooner or later we would bump into each other. And I was right. She was sitting in front of the mirror. Her eyes were red, her lips were bare. She looked so strange, so small. I approached her calmly as if by accident. Helen, I said, long time no see. She flinched, turned around, smiled badly, crookedly, forcefully. Oh, Suzanne, yes, amazing. How's life? More stable than I could have imagined, I replied quietly. She didn't ask about anything. She just nodded. And then she suddenly said, you knew, didn't you? I looked into her eyes. No regret. No anger. Just exhaustion. I knew what he was to me. And I couldn't believe he would become something to you. She lowered her gaze. And I left. Without malice. Without victory. With only one thought. The truth always comes home. Even if it takes a long time. 2 more weeks passed. I hardly thought about them, honestly. Life had long since returned to its new shores. Work, sports, books, phone calls to my son. I was learning again to be a woman who didn't let anyone take the air out of the room. But one evening, when I was coming home from the store, there was a car parked near my building. A strange car. And I all too familiar. She got out. Helen. I hadn't seen her like this ever. No makeup, wearing a gray coat, looking confused, her usual confidence crumbling like ashes. I'm sorry I came without calling, she started. I just didn't have anyone to talk to. I opened the door. I motioned for her to come in. Inside me, there was silence, but not resentment, more like a strange calm, as if I had known she was coming. We sat down in the kitchen. I made tea. She was silent for a long time, then suddenly exhaled. He's doing the same thing to me that he did to you, isn't he? I didn't answer. Not right away. She continued. He leaves, doesn't say a word, disappears for 2 days, and then says, I'm just tired. I tried to be easygoing, cheerful, interesting. I did everything, and now I don't recognize myself. I cry more and more often. I'm afraid to talk. I realized that I wasn't a friend to you, but a scene I finished. You wanted to play, and I was real. That always scares those who live in a play. Helen lowered her gaze. He said I've become boring too. There it was. The same phrase. The same words. It was as if he just took the same phrases out of a closet and hung them on new women. You wanted him, I said calmly. You got him. But love isn't a prize. It's not a way to prove you're better. It's life. And with him, there is no life. Helen cried. And for the first time, I didn't feel any schadenfreude. I just felt sorry for her. Because I had already been down that road. And I knew how painful it was to realize that you had destroyed someone else for a happiness that would never be yours. A few days later, Helen wrote to me again. She didn't ask to meet, just a short message. You were right. He's lying. He's not coming home at night anymore. And yesterday, I found a woman's hair clip in his car. Not mine. I sat there with my phone in my hand. No emotions, just a silent acknowledgement. History was repeating itself. Not mirrored, not literal, but with the same piercing pain that I had once experienced. Helen couldn't help herself. She followed him. She told me about it later, in details I didn't ask for, but I listened silently. I waited outside the office. She nervously fiddled with the ring on her finger. He came out later than usual. I followed him. And do you know where he turned? To the old neighborhood, to some house on the outskirts. He opened the gate, and a woman was already waiting for him there. Young, with a dog. She hugged him like she'd known him for a long time. They laughed. Helen swallowed hard. I sat in the car, and suddenly I felt so ashamed. Not for him. For myself. For thinking I was better. Smarter. That I could build something with him that you couldn't. I didn't interrupt. I had nothing to add. He's a liar, Susie. He always was, I just didn't see it before. Or didn't want to. That evening, I sat with a cup of tea and remembered an episode that I had long since forbidden myself to think about. A few years ago, 2 months before he left, I found a piece of paper in his jacket. Crumpled. Yellowed. Almost illegible. It was a letter. An old one. From a woman named Melissa. With warm words. And a request not to forget that what happened then was real. At the time, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe a colleague. Maybe someone random. I burned that letter. Not because I was afraid, because I didn't want to know. Now I knew for sure, Mark was not faithful to anyone. Not even himself. He was always running. After youth. For attention. For the illusion that something desirable still existed. And those who happened to be around him were just temporary stops on his eternal journey away from himself. Are you going to get revenge? Helen asked suddenly when we met again. I looked at her. Revenge is for those who still have feelings. All I have left is clarity. And in it there is much more strength than in any revenge. Several days passed since our last meeting, and I was almost certain that Helen would not show up again. It seemed that she had chosen the path of proud silence, the very one we often use to cover wounds that are not ready to heal. But I was wrong. On Friday evening, around 8 o'clock, she was standing at my door again. No makeup, wearing an old coat, and looking as if she had been betrayed not by one person, but by the whole world. I let her in without saying a word. Only when she sat down on the edge of the sofa and dropped her purse on the floor did she speak. That was my niece. I didn't understand right away. Who? The one he was visiting. The one with the dog. Her name is Kelly. She's 26. My sister's daughter. I got her an internship at his company a year ago. She fell silent. And I froze. Helen told me she had found the correspondence. At first by accident. Then on purpose. Screenshots. Photos. Messages. Gifts. Kisses. They had been seeing each other for 6 months. Behind her back. Under her roof. In the house where she had welcomed Kelly on Thanksgiving as if she were her own daughter. I feel like I've been wiped out, she whispered. Like everything I knew about love, about family, even about myself, was just a lie. He didn't just betray me. He chose someone from my own family. I covered her hand with mine, not to comfort her, just because at that moment there was nothing else left. I remembered how Mark once told me that he loved pure emotions. That youth wasn't about age, but about the freshness of perception. He wasn't looking for women. He was looking for mirrors. And every time, he broke them when the reflection began to show his true self. Helen sighed. I don't know how to live now. You do, I said. You're just scared. Because for the first time, you're truly alone. No games. No masks. No trying to be better than anyone else. Now it's just you. And that's not scary. It's a chance. She looked at me, and for the first time in all this time, there was no panic in her eyes. Only fatigue. And a glimmer of hope. Helen made up her mind. That same evening, after we said goodbye, she sent Mark a short message. It's over. I know everything. I'll pack my things tomorrow. No hysterics. No tears. Like a woman who finally saw herself not through the prism of someone else's gaze, but as she had always been, alive, vulnerable, but real. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened the door and froze. Standing there was Kelly. She was holding a paper bag. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Her face was pale and frightened. She didn't look like the young woman who had sent Mark photos of herself kissing him. She looked like she had been torn from a dream. "Miss Suzanne," she whispered. "Please, can I come in for a minute?" I let her in without saying a word. Not out of politeness. Out of curiosity, and I must admit, a sense of detached pain. After all, I too had once been a young woman who thought she knew better. "I didn't want it to turn out like this," she began. He said Helen didn't understand him, that they were almost broken up. Stop, I said calmly. "This isn't a confession. And I'm not a priest." Kelly lowered her eyes. "I just didn't think it would be so complicated." He was so attentive, mature. I felt grown up around him. And now my aunt won't talk to me, my mom yells at me, I lost my job. I didn't know I would ruin everything. I looked at her and didn't see an enemy. I saw who I once was, trusting, led, looking for love where there was only a need to be meted. "Kelly," I said, "you're not evil, but you're weak. You became an opportunity for him to feel young. That's not love. It's an attempt to escape age, consequences, responsibility. And you're not the first to believe him, but you may be the last to pay the full price." She sobbed. And I added, "Leave. Not me. His life. If you want to save yourself from yourself." Kelly left. I sat down by the window, made some tea, and thought that the most bitter thing about this story wasn't who betrayed whom. It was how many women, so different, he had managed to make doubt themselves before he even glanced into his own soul for a moment. On Sunday morning, Helen drove to the house where she had recently thought she would start a new, happy life. She asked me in advance not to come with her. "I need to go through this alone," she said firmly. "No witnesses. No support. No you." I respected her choice, but I couldn't settle down all day. Towards evening, the phone rang. "It's over," Helen said briefly. He was at home. He tried to talk, but it was too late. Too late for excuses. Too late for remorse. She said she had entered the house like a stranger, with keys that no longer felt like hers. She had packed her things silently into several bags. Mark stood in the bedroom doorway, then came closer. "Helen, wait. Are you really ready to give up everything? Because of one incident?" She looked up at him. "Do you really think it's just about Kelly?" He fell silent. "It's not just one incident, Mark. It's you. The way you are. With all these women, excuses, and constant dissatisfaction. I'm not 17 to believe that everything can still be fixed. I don't want to be the convenient version of myself anymore." He reached out, but she pulled away. "I didn't come here to talk. I came here to leave. Not from you to myself." When she left the house, it was as if 100 pounds had been lifted off her shoulders. Not physically, emotionally. And for the first time in years, Helen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She just drove with the wind in her face and the feeling that she had finally stopped being someone else's shadow. I met her at my place. She brought a bottle of white wine and 2 glasses. "What for?" I asked when she poured the wine. Helen smiled. "For now I know what it means to choose not him, not you, not someone else, but myself." After Helen left, something inside me shifted too. It was as if we had both stepped out of an old play where every year we had to play roles. She was the new wife. I was the ex, wise and calm. But the play was over, and now there was silence. Silence in which memories suddenly began to resound. I was sorting through an old box of papers, and I came across a photograph. It was from the old days when Mark and I were still together. We were standing in the garden. I was wearing white and he was wearing a light blue shirt. We were smiling. It seemed like an ordinary picture, but behind us, slightly to the side, stood a young girl. I remembered. It was Allison, an intern at his office. In that photo, she was probably 23. At the time, I didn't even notice how often he mentioned her name. Now, years later, I remembered the evening when I came to his office unexpectedly to have dinner together. He was sitting in the conference room with Allison, close together. Too close. "Hi," I said then. "I hope I'm not interrupting." They both flinched. Allison quickly gathered herself and left. Mark explained that she was stressed out about her project and he was just giving her advice. I didn't dig any deeper at the time. I trusted him, or pretended to trust him because I didn't want to see the crack that was already starting to show. Now, after all these years, I realized that the first crack was right there. I just didn't recognize it at the time. I looked at the photo for a long time, and I didn't feel any anger. Just a strange clarity. Mark always needed to feel needed by someone who admired him. He wasn't looking for a partner, he was looking for a mirror. And when the mirror started to reflect him as he really was, with age, fatigue, and doubts, he simply found a new one. I put the photo away in a drawer, not because I wanted to forget, but because there was no longer any need to remember. I didn't plan on seeing him. All I wanted that day was to go to the grocery store, buy a baguette, some cheese, and something for dinner. A normal evening. Normal shopping. But when I turned the corner in the fruit section, I saw him. Mark. He was standing by the apples, choosing carefully as always. In a white shirt with a few gray hairs. And next to him, no one. No Helen. No Kelly. No latest girlfriend. He saw me too. And for a moment, surprise flashed across his face, and then something else. Something that looked like regret. I walked past him. I didn't plan to stop, but he took a step toward me. "Suzanne," he said quietly. "You look good." I nodded. "Thanks. You too. Steady." He smiled bitterly. "I heard you saw Helen again." "Yes. We're talking." "How is she?" "Better than when she was with you." He stepped back. "Not for long." Then he spoke slowly. "You know, sometimes I think, maybe if we hadn't ended things the way we did." "No, Mark," I interrupted. "No ifs. You were never looking for a partner, you were looking for a reflection. I tried for a long time to be that reflection. Then Helen. Then, it didn't matter who. You're not a bad person. You've just always been afraid to see yourself for who you really are." He nodded. "You're probably right. It's too late." We stood there in silence for a few seconds. Then I added, "But you know, despite everything, I'm grateful to you." "For what?" "For helping me understand how important it is to be honest with yourself, even if it means leaving forever." I turned around and walked to the cash register. He didn't stop me, and that was it. When I left the store, the sky was clear, and inside I felt light, the kind that only comes when you are finally free. Helen came to see me on Sunday morning. Without warning, with coffee in her hands and a smile I hadn't seen on her face in years. She wasn't just calm, she was whole. It was as if all the pieces of her that had been scattered had finally fallen into place. She sat down on my old sofa, leaned back, and with a strange sense of pleasure said, "He started writing to me." I knew immediately who she was talking about. We hadn't mentioned his name for several weeks, as if the name itself could reopen the wound, but there was no wound anymore, only a scar that could now be looked at. I raised my eyebrows, and she continued, sipping her coffee. "At first it was corny. I'm sorry. I ruined everything. Then a little deeper. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." And yesterday I got a letter where he writes that maybe we can still work things out. I asked her what she replied. Helen laughed. Not maliciously, not resentfully, just the way women laugh when they finally realize their own worth. She took out her phone and showed me the short text she had sent him last night. "Mark, you can't take back what you threw away. And I don't pick up trash." We both laughed. Not because we wanted to humiliate him, not because we wanted revenge, but because there was a power in that sentence that we had both been searching for years, the power of a woman who is no longer willing to be a backup plan, a second fiddle, a silent shadow. We remembered how we used to swallow our resentment, how we justified the unforgivable, how we feared loneliness, which turned out not to be scary at all. On the contrary, it was almost pleasant, the silence in which you can hear yourself. Helen said that Mark was alone now. Kelly disappeared as soon as his promises and gifts ran out. And now he's trying to get back to where he once had stability and warmth. But the woman who once tried to understand with a tremor in her voice now has a clear gaze and firm boundaries. And I realized that everything that seemed like weakness to both of us had become the foundation of our new life. Without him, without fear, without lies, only with ourselves, the real us. A few more weeks passed, and life settled into a quiet, warm groove that I had never even dreamed of before. I woke up without anxiety, ate breakfast without rushing, but with pleasure, baked pies again using my mother's recipe, and went to the lake on weekends, just to sit by the water. I didn't look for reasons to be needed, didn't try to prove anything to anyone. I just lived. And on one of those Sundays, when the air smelled of wet grass and bread, I received a letter. A real one. On paper. In an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, it was Helen's. I was surprised. We saw each other almost every other day, wrote to each other, shared everything. Why a letter? I opened it and began to read. There was nothing about Mark, about the past, about the pain. It was a thank you letter. Simple and beautiful. She wrote that when everything fell apart, she thought she would never be able to trust people again. That she felt broken, stupid, used. But it was my reaction, not revenge, not reproach, but silence and understanding that allowed her not to break down completely. She wrote that perhaps we would never have become friends under different circumstances. We were too different, too stubborn, too proud. But now, having gone through the same pain, we had become closer than we could have imagined. At the end of the letter was a line that suddenly made me cry. She wrote, "Thank you for not turning away from me when you had 1,000 reasons to. You didn't just forgive me, you stayed by my side. And that, as I now understand, is much stronger than revenge." I sat on the porch with that letter in my hands, and the sun fell on the pages as if it were reading along with me. I didn't think it would be so important, but it turned out to be important. Because in my entire life, I had never received gratitude for kindness. For patience, yes. For understanding, maybe. But for the kindness you give when no one expects it. When you've been betrayed and you still choose to be human. No one says thank you for that. And now they have. And I realized that it was all worth it. Everything we went through, everything we learned, everything we endured brought us here, to a new chapter, where I am no longer the person I used to be, no longer deceived, no longer alone. I am a woman who chose herself, and I have no regrets. A month after the letter, Helen and I went to a small town on the coast just to relax, escape the hustle and bustle, and get away from anything that reminded us of the past. We rented a modest house right by the water. In the evenings, we drank white wine, ate cheese straight from the board, covered ourselves with blankets, and listened to the wind rustling in the pine trees. We talked a lot. Not about Mark, not about the pain, now more about who we had become. About how we used to bend to other people's expectations. How we allowed ourselves to be complacent. How we couldn't say no even when our souls were screaming. We remembered our 20s, 30s, 40s, and laughed. Because back then, it seemed that life was about being liked, being right, being good, being the one for whom someone would change. And now it all seemed so silly. Helen said, I was with a man who loved his own reflection for so long. And I tried to fit in with him, just so the glass wouldn't crack. And then you came along, and I saw myself not in him, but in you. The real me. And the strong mane. I felt warm. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition that we had both grown up. From pain, from mistakes, from everything that seemed like the end, but turned out to be the beginning. The next morning, we went to the ocean. The wind was cold, the sand clung to our feet, but we walked silently and calmly. And suddenly, in the middle of the empty beach, Helen stopped and said, if you hadn't forgiven me then, I would have become a completely different person. Lost, embittered, distrustful. But you pulled me back. Thank you. I hugged her. And in that embrace, there was no resentment, no regrets, just a feeling that everything had finally fallen into place. Because we were no longer women who had been betrayed. We were women who had survived. And we had become better than we had ever been. Without Mark. Without lies. Only with ourselves and with each other. After our trip, I returned home a different person. Everything seemed to be in its place. The same furniture, the same books on the shelf, the same slight creak of the floor by the window, but something inside me had changed profoundly. I no longer waited for phone calls, explanations, or apologies. Everything that had come before seemed like a distant life belonging to another woman, and I didn't miss her. I began to wake up without a heaviness in my chest. Mornings became a time of peace, rather than the usual jumble of thoughts in my head. I bought a new tablecloth, moved the sofa, and changed the bedspread in my bedroom. Helen joked that I was doing emotional renovations, and she was probably right. Because I finally allowed myself to live not as an ex-wife or a betrayed friend, but simply as a woman who still had a future. At work, I took on a project that I had previously refused because I was afraid I couldn't handle it. But now I wanted to try. And to my surprise, I found that I could do it easily. People started to gravitate toward me. Colleagues who had previously exchanged only a perfunctory "good morning" now lingered at my desk, sharing stories and asking for advice. I was interested in listening to them, not to give a perfunctory answer, but because I had regained an inner peace that made room for others. I started going to cafes in the evenings, just to read a book with a glass of wine, and once I noticed a man of about 50 at the next table, with an open face and slightly sad eyes, glance in my direction a couple of times. Before, I would have turned away, closed myself off, pretended not to notice. But now I just smiled. Not because I was looking for a date, not because I wanted someone to like me, but because I was no longer afraid. Not of loneliness, not of trust. Because I had survived the betrayal of those I loved, and I hadn't become a worse person. On the contrary, I had become stronger. And now every day felt like a gift. Not because someone was there, but because I was with myself and I was happy. I didn't immediately decide to tell Helen about the man. We didn't meet, we didn't talk. We just exchanged glances a couple of times in that very cafe where I now loved to spend my evenings. He didn't come often, always alone, reading the newspaper, making notes in a notebook, drinking strong black coffee, and sometimes ordering cheesecake. He had the hands of a man who works hard and the eyes of a man who knows what pain is. That's probably why I took a liking to him, not because he was particularly good-looking, but because he seemed alive, real, quiet, but attentive. And there was something touching about that. One day, I caught his eye and smiled again. And he came over. Just like that, easily, calmly. We talked. Nothing important, just a little about the weather, the book I was reading, coffee. He didn't ask for my number or make any hints. But I knew this was the beginning. After that meeting, I thought about it for a long time. Not about him, about myself. Could I let someone in again? Did I want to? Or was I happy on my own? The answer didn't come right away, but it was simple. I didn't owe anything. Not to myself, not to the world. But if it suddenly got warm, I wouldn't turn away. I told Helen. She listened attentively, not to discuss, but to be there. Then she said, "You deserve to be happy again." Without fear, without conditions. Just human. We drank wine. For the first time ever, it wasn't a toast to the past, but to something that was just beginning. I realized how I had changed. Before, I had looked to men for salvation, recognition, approval. Now, I wasn't looking for anything. I was just living. And if someone happened to be there for my new life, then so be it. And if not, I was fine with that. For the first time in many years, I felt that I knew how to be happy. Without support, without crutches. Just myself. We met again, almost by accident, like in a book where every scene seems to have been written in advance. He approached me just as I was closing the book and asked if I liked the ending. I replied that the ending was honest, but left a strange aftertaste. He nodded, as if he understood not only the book, but also my life. We talked all evening, first at a table, then walking along the street, where the soft lights of shop windows were already lit and passers-by whispered so as not to scare away the July evening. His name was Thomas. He was an architect, a widower, and there was no falsehood in his voice, only the calmness of a man who had lost a lot and learned to cherish what remained. He didn't ask unnecessary questions or pry into my past, as if he knew that I would tell him everything myself when I was ready. For now, we just walked side by side, and I wasn't afraid. The next morning, I woke up and felt no anxiety. Not in my body, not in my heart. I didn't analyze every word or look for hidden meanings. I just smiled, remembering how he had adjusted my scarf when the wind blew and how he had said that my laughter reminded him of the sound of the wind in a pine forest. It was a strange association, but for some reason it touched my soul. I wrote to Helen. She sent me a sticker with 2 glasses and the phrase, "I'm proud of you." She knew how far I had come to not be afraid to open up again. And I knew that if something went wrong, I wouldn't lose myself again. Because now I stand on my own 2 feet. And even if the road is difficult, I won't turn back. Thomas invited me to the gallery next week. I agreed. Not because I wanted to get out there, but because when I was with him, I felt like someone was gently holding my hand, not pulling me, just walking beside me. And that was the first time in many years. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what was to come. I knew one thing: my life would no longer be someone else's shadow, because I had regained my light. A little over a year has passed since that wedding, where I stood aside, holding back the tremors in my voice and smiling as if it all meant nothing. Back then, I thought that a smile was all I had left. But now I knew that a smile was just the beginning. Today, I stood in front of the mirror again, not in someone else's shadow, not as an ex, betrayed, or forgotten, but as a woman who had been through it all. I was wearing a simple, light dress. My hair was softly gathered, slightly carelessly, just the way I liked it. On my wrist was a thin bracelet, a gift from Helen. She was the first to arrive, helped set the table, cut the cheese, and laughed as she remembered how we both used to believe in other people's fairy tales. Now we had our own. Thomas came up to me, put his arms around my shoulders, looked in the mirror, and said, "You look like a woman who has it all." And I realized that yes, I really did have it all. I had survived betrayal, loss, loneliness. I had learned to forgive, not for them, but for myself. I allowed myself to be happy without waiting for someone else's approval. And now I was standing in a house full of warmth, birds singing outside the window, and Helen telling a joke to one of our mutual friends in the kitchen, and I knew that I was no longer alone. I didn't know if we would ever see Mark again. Maybe he was really gone for good, lost in his mistakes, like so many men who can't admit they're wrong. Or maybe he would show up one day to demand something else. But I knew that now he couldn't take anything away from me. Not my strength, not my freedom, not my new life. Because everything I had now, I had built myself. With pain, with mistakes, but honestly. I was no longer a woman who had been betrayed. I was a woman who had survived and triumphed. And most importantly, I hadn't lost myself. Now I had a home where people laughed instead of arguing. People with whom I could be silent and still be understood. And a man who didn't demand, didn't pull, didn't possess, he was just there. We went out onto the porch, the wind rustled the curtains, and the tea in my cup smelled of mint and sunshine. And I thought, if someone had told me a year ago that all this would happen, I wouldn't have believed them. But now I knew, sometimes to find yourself, you have to lose everything first. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Thomas and I started traveling little by little, not as tourists, not staying in expensive hotels, but going to places where we just wanted to be. We went to tiny towns where the local bakeries smelled of cinnamon and where passers-by greeted each other by name. We stayed in old houses with wooden floors and open windows, where in the morning you could hear the shutters creaking and the birds singing. These trips weren't for photos or stories, they were for ourselves. There, far away from everything, I realized how many years I had lived in a state of tension, as if every day I was preparing for a storm. And now, I was just breathing. We sat on benches outside old churches, read aloud to each other, found little shops with junk where you could buy something completely useless but terribly warm. And on every trip, I caught myself thinking, I can feel again. Not analyzing, not defending myself, not anticipating, just feeling. I remembered that wedding. I remembered Helen standing in her dress, arm in arm with Mark, and me standing a little apart. Back then, I thought I had lost. But now I knew that was when it all began. Because pain taught me honesty. And honesty isn't about saying everything, it's about acknowledging everything inside yourself. I admitted that I had been betrayed. I admitted that it hurt. I admitted that I had also been wrong, clinging, forgiving, living in an illusion. But I no longer wanted to be perfect. I wanted to be alive. We returned from a trip to find a letter in our mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a note from Mark, just a few lines. He wrote that he was sorry. He didn't ask for forgiveness or to meet up. He just admitted that he was wrong. I put the letter in my desk drawer and never took it out again, because it didn't change anything. It wasn't the beginning of a conversation, but the end. I didn't feel any anger, just a slight sadness. Not about him, but about how much time we sometimes waste on those who don't know how to love. But I no longer lived in the past. I lived in the morning when Thomas served coffee, in the evening when Helen called, and in this quiet, new life where there were no more false words. Sometimes I woke up before dawn, not out of anxiety as before, but just because of the quiet inner peace that had now settled in me. I got up, poured myself a cup of hot tea, wrapped myself in a warm blanket, and sat down by the window. Thomas slept in the next room, breathing evenly, like a man who no longer had anything to prove in life. Outside the window, it was slowly getting light. Birds began to chirp in the branches, and I just watched as a new day was born. Those were my moments. There was no past, no future, only the warm present. And that present was surprisingly cozy. One day, I got a phone call. It was unexpected. It was Lena, an old friend whom I hadn't spoken to since my wedding, I think. She was silent for a few seconds before speaking. Then she said quietly, "You were right." I didn't ask what she was talking about. I didn't need to know the details. I heard fatigue in her voice, pain, disappointment, everything that I had once felt. I said, "Come over. Just come over." She arrived the next day. She looked at me confused, as if she didn't understand how I had survived it all. I smiled. We drank tea, and I didn't say a word of reproach, because there was no point in bringing up what had already been through. Her eyes were different. They showed broken pride, searching for support. And I gave her support, not out of revenge, but out of strength, because now I knew what it was like to hit rock bottom and climb back up. We were silent for a long time. Then Lena said, "You look really happy." And I nodded. I was happy, but not because everything was good now, but because I had learned to live even when things were bad. I had learned to forgive, not for the sake of others, but for myself. And now, looking at her, I realized that at that very moment, my past was finally gone. Not because it disappeared, but because it no longer hurt. Autumn came unnoticed. The leaves began to turn yellow, as if someone in a heavenly workshop had carefully painted the edges of each tree. The air became clear and fresh, and I started walking more again. I knew every turn, every bench, every path in the park in the city, but now everything felt different, as if I had returned to it anew, as a different woman. Thomas suggested we have a little party, no special occasion, just because. To celebrate that we are alive, that we love, and that we breathe freely, he said, and I smiled. We invited our friends, those who had become our true family. Even Lena came. She had changed a lot. She had slimmed down, wore light-colored clothes, and no longer lowered her eyes when she spoke. I was happy for her because I knew she was on her own path. There was an amazing feeling of completeness at this party. Not the kind you see in movies with garlands and perfect tables, but a real feeling with genuine laughter, warm words, simple dishes, and music that someone played on the piano. I watched everyone and suddenly realized that I no longer felt like the heroine of a drama. I am not the woman who is betrayed. I am not the one who is laughed at. I'm not the one who is forgotten. I'm the one who went through it all, digested it, and came out on top. After the party, I sat on the porch for a long time. Thomas was reading something nearby, his hand on my shoulder. I thought about how long the road to this silence had been. How many tears, how many sleepless nights, how much anger and despair. And now only the wind and the stars. And I thought, maybe everything in life happens for a reason. Maybe you have to go through betrayal to understand who you are, and to learn to choose yourself not out of pride, but out of love. I chose myself, and that was the beginning of a new life. I received a letter, a real paper letter with elegant handwriting and no return address, but I knew immediately who had written it. It was Mark's mother. We hadn't spoken since her family took their son's side, and I didn't even expect her to ever want to talk to me again. But the letter was there. It began with the words, "If I had known then what I know now, I didn't read it right away." It lay on the table for several days, unopened, but heavy like a stone. I wasn't afraid of the pain. I was afraid of returning in my thoughts to a place I hadn't lived in for a long time. But I opened it anyway. She wrote sincerely, without embellishment. She admitted that she had been blinded by maternal attachment, pride, and fear of admitting that her son was not who she had always thought he was. She wrote that she often thought of me, her daughter-in-law, who had cared for her more than her own family during difficult times. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just thanked me for the kindness I had once shown her. I cried, not out of pain, but out of an unexpected feeling of closure. It was as if something that had been torn apart long ago had finally come to an end. I didn't reply. I didn't need a continuation. But I put the letter in a box where I kept everything important, not material things, but things close to my heart. Thomas found me in the kitchen, still holding the letter in my hands. He didn't ask anything. He just came over, hugged me, and said, "You've become the strongest woman I've ever known." And I replied, "I'm just tired of being weak." And we both knew it was true. I didn't dream of revenge. I didn't make plans to prove my worth to anyone. All I wanted was to live. Peacefully. Truly. And that's exactly what I had now. And even if some people never admit they were wrong, I don't need that anymore. I've already won, just by not breaking down. One Saturday evening, Thomas and I decided to sort through some old boxes in the attic. There was a lot of stuff there, things I had long since parted with emotionally, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. We opened them one by one: letters, old photographs, jewelry, broken trinkets. At the bottom of one box, I found my old diary. The cover was worn, the pages faded. I held it in my hands like a tiny piece of myself, the person I once was, who believed, feared, and dreamed. I flipped through the pages, and my whole life flashed before my eyes. My first disappointment, my hopes for a family, the pain after the betrayal, the loneliness I sank into, and that dark night when I promised myself I would never let anyone break me again. Thomas sat silently beside me, sometimes glancing over my shoulder, sometimes just holding my hand. I read aloud one of the entries where I had written, "I don't know who I am without him." At that moment, I really didn't know. I was a shadow, a woman whose value depended on whether someone else loved her. But now I knew for sure I am me. Not as a wife, not as an ex, not as a loyal friend, but as a woman who picked herself up piece by piece and became strong not out of anger, but out of inner peace. I burned that diary in the fireplace. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed to keep proof of the path I had traveled. It was inside me, and everything that was important I had already taken with me. Thomas said, "We're doing this right, forgiving without returning." I nodded. He was right. And that evening, amid the ashes of old pages, the smell of coffee, and the light breeze from the attic window, I felt that I was free, real, and no one could take that freedom away from me anymore. Not the past, not people, not memories. It was now inside me. Almost 2 years have passed since that wedding, where I smiled through the pain, knowing that everything was just beginning. And now, standing at the window in my house, with a cup of warm tea and a light rain falling outside, I remembered that day like a distant past, like a story not about me, but about some other woman. Helen was no longer part of Mark's life. They parted quietly, without drama, but with complete clarity. She moved away to another state, I think, and we never crossed paths again. I heard bits and pieces from friends, and every time I felt grateful to fate for letting me go through all that. Because now I was living a life I had never even dreamed of before. Thomas had become more than just the man I loved. He had become part of my soul, the bright part that I had once been afraid to show. We didn't just start over together. We developed a deep, mature love, without promises, without illusions, with simple gestures and genuine involvement. We got into the habit of spending quiet evenings together on Sundays, no phones, no news, just music and conversation. We shared memories, made plans, baked something, laughed. Those were the happiest evenings of my life. Sometimes I thought how little we needed for true happiness. No confessions, no excuses, not even a perfect ending. Just someone nearby who understands, accepts, and looks in the same direction. I wrote down my story, not for revenge, not for a book, just for myself. So that someday, maybe my daughter or granddaughter, or just someone tired of pain, could read it and understand there is a way out. It's not always quick. It's not always easy, but it's there. And it starts with one simple choice, to choose yourself. That was my path. Long, sometimes dark, but so important. And now, with only the last page left, I knew that only light lay ahead. When I closed the door of the old house where I once lived with Mark for the last time, there was no bitterness, no regrets. That house was no longer my story. It had become a stranger long before I physically left it. I looked at the empty walls that remembered my tears, my hopes, my smile through the pain, and I forgave. Not him, myself, for everything I had once allowed myself to endure. For all the years I believed in illusions. For being afraid to choose myself. Now I was driving back to our new home, to Thomas, where it smelled of cinnamon and apples, where comfort was hidden in the little things in a cracked mug, in the armchair by the window, in the blanket we bought together at some street market. We were going to celebrate my birthday. I was turning 61, and I had never felt younger, more alive, more real. The guests had already gathered. Among them were new friends and those who had stayed by my side during the difficult years. Lena was sitting on the porch, chatting with Thomas, laughing easily, as if the past no longer had any power over her. And I just stood at the doorway, watching it all with deep gratitude. I didn't need applause, proof, or revenge. I already had everything. I had found myself. In the evening, when everyone had left, Thomas turned on some quiet music and took an old photograph out of a box, the one of me on the beach, laughing and holding a balloon. He said, "Look, you've come back to this woman. Only now you're even stronger." And I smiled, because he was right. My story began in the shadows, went through rain and storms, and came out into the light. It's not about revenge. It's not about defeating someone. It's about returning to yourself. And that's the most important thing, because once you choose yourself, you will never be the same again. And in that lies strength.